Hello, my name is Raynor. I'm the Director of Business Advising here at CEI. We help entrepreneurs in Maine start and grow their business and offer informative workshops and interactive multi-session peer groups available live on Zoom or in person, in addition to one-on-one business advising. For more information about CEI, please visit ceimaine.org. Today, I'm going to be discussing how to put together a sources and uses statement. And as a bonus, we'll talk about how that becomes your day one balance sheet. So before I dig in, I always like to start with a disclaimer. I'm not an accountant. For proper tax advice, we recommend you talk to a CPA. What we're talking about today is applying for a loan, a sources and uses statement, and then the basic financial statement of a balance sheet. So we'll cover why bother learning this information, how important it is to you starting a business and thinking about taking on some debt or equity to do so. We'll break it down into the uses of cash, the second part of a sources and uses statement, which are the easiest ways to identify what you need to spend to get your business off the ground, and the sources of cash, which is where is that cash coming from. Those two things will need to equal to make sure that you're able to progress and move forward. And then we'll finish with a little bit about the balance sheet. So why bother? Can I leave this to my bookkeeper or my accountant? Well, first and foremost, the financials are really the language of professionals that you're going to interact with. So if you plan on approaching a bank and you're asking for a loan, the sources and uses statement is one of the first things that they're going to ask you for, because it outlines what your equity is that you are investing and what you're asking for. Furthermore, if you're planning on reducing your tax burden throughout the year or working with an accountant and mitigate, some tax implications and understand them, and the financials are an aspect of that language that you will need to speak. And if you plan on exiting or selling your business, then a broker will put a value on your business based on the financial performance. And even if you don't want debt, if you're considering equity, private equity, these are the questions that will be asked as well. Secondly, why I love the financials as an owner operator of a business, as somebody who helps others run their business. This is really the foundational piece of understanding where you're going. So if you understand the financials, you can plan ahead. And as long as you have $1 in your bank account, you can continue to make the decisions that best increase that business growth. So being financially viable is very important. So the uses of cash is really the question of how much do you need? That's what the bank's asking when they say, can you provide us with a sources and uses, right? And there's a hidden question in there, right? If you show up to a lender and you say, I think I need $500,000. Well, that shows a lack of responsibility around the education and understanding and research about exactly what you need confidently to move forward. And when you're talking to a lender or an investor, confidence is a big part of that conversation, right? To be able to say, I know exactly what I need, and I've done the research to make sure that I will be and remain viable looking ahead. So the uses of cash are usually broken down into kind of tangible uses of cash. Those are the easiest things to put your hands on. You can look online, you can go to a local store and identify, I need these things. You can talk to a contractor about the fit out, make an offer on the real estate. You can buy furniture, right? So these are things that are tangible. And the reason tangibility is important is because that creates collateral that secures the asset for a lender or an investor to consider and mitigate their risk in investing with you. The other aspect of your uses of cash are the intangibles, right? These are things that are harder to collateralize. There's nothing that you can put your hands on and sell if things go south. So things like a lease deposit or utility deposits, or even some inventory is kind of, some banks consider inventory to be more or less intangible because in essence, it ages too quickly, or if you are unable to sell it, then there is no real value with it. Licensing the permits, legal and professional fees, building a website, right? These are things that once that money is invested, it's gone, right? And then working capital is the last piece of that intangible puzzle. I have a whole slide dedicated to working capital because it's so important, right? So Working capital gets thrown around a lot. For existing businesses, working capital is very important for seasonality to say, okay, how much do I need in my bank account going into that off season to make sure I don't bounce any checks and I can cover my payroll until, the next season comes back in. For a starting business, someone who's thinking about launching a new business or hanging a shingle, working capital is that idea of how much will I lose before I start digging my way back out? And how much do I need in my bank account to not bounce a check and come out the other side, right? So this really relies on a conservative and thought out set of financial projections to cover all of your operating expenses and the debt needed to say, okay, if I lose $5,000 in the first month and $3,000 in the second month and $1,000 in the third month, and then I break even and get better. Well, I need, $9,001 in my bank account so that I almost scrape the bottom and come out the other side again. I don't want to bounce a check. I do not want to go back to the bank or the investor and ask for more money because I misjudged it, right? That's that confidence piece. Are they confident in you and your projections? And it's much better for everybody to be, pleasantly surprised at how well you do than unpleasantly disappointed. So setting the expectation and then having that amount and monitoring it carefully so that you can come out the other side is the use of working capital. So this is kind of what the uses would look like. I got my equipment, my lease security deposits, some improvements in there. I've worked with a contractor. I have a quote, what that costs, insurance, closing fees, legal fees, some inventory. I have some pre-launch marketing, right? And my working capital piece. So that's the number I need, 77,200, of which 8,000 will be sitting in my bank account on day one, right? My working capital. So now what, right? So that gives me a target. And now I need to find how I'm going to fill that. I have 77,000 to fill. Where is that going to come from? The first thing is always going to be this idea of bootstrapping. You have to have some skin in the game, some equity. From a lender's perspective, it's usually a minimum of 10 to 20%. They want to see that you are as invested as they are, right? So that you, maybe not for a dollar amount, but emotionally, mentally, that you're going to be losing sleep before the bank does, right? So if you can't finance it entirely yourself, if you're not looking at that number and saying, well, I have that in cash, I'm just going to do this myself. I don't want a bank. I don't want an investor. Okay, then, if we have some to put in, then what's left? What's next? So if I have 77,000 and I have 20,000 of my own, then I need 57 more. And so that we can look for financing, right? So what can be financed really relies on the investor's appetite and the lender's requirements, underwriting requirements, right? And that really hinges on what is supportable through the business. So let's start with this idea of what is the difference between debt, commercial debt, borrowing money from a bank, and equity, right? So commercial debt, if you go out and you find somebody or you find a bank or talk to a lender, or you go to where you have your savings account and they have a small business loan or something, they follow, pretty structured debt principles, which means it's a 5 or a 7 year term. Interest rates vary, can be anywhere between 7 and 10% right now. And you pay that monthly principal and interest the same way you do with a car loan or with a home mortgage, right? It's just that check clears every month and you pay that. And after the period, the amortization schedule, you've paid it off and it goes away. That's usually more risk adverse. They have, underwriting requirements around that risk and risk mitigation around collateral. And so, maybe you can borrow the entire 80% that you're still looking for, or the 57,000 you're looking for. Maybe you don't want to. Maybe you want to go the equity route, right? So equity, unlike debt, which does not dilute your ownership, you still own 100%. You just owe the bank some money, like you own a house and you owe the bank some money on the house. Equity is you have a partner, right? don't take a dowry if you don't want the marriage, right? So the equity piece is when somebody is coming alongside you and investing in you. And because that is a more personal relationship, it's very flexible, right? You can have those terms be, convert to debt after a period of time. You can have them receive distributions as you do, as equity gets paid out, but they remain partners with you until the end of that relationship. And that is entirely determined by the partnership agreement that the two of you agreed to going in together. So there's some great upside to having equity. They have no qualms about supporting you or working alongside you or bringing their assets or relationships to the table to help get the business off the ground. Debt won't do that, right? Debt will sit in the background and let you run the business as you see fit. Equity has some downsides. They are a partner. They have responsibilities and rights as laid out in a partnership agreement. So balance those two things, the ease and flexibility of equity versus the relationship that is implied in that. Whether you go debt or equity, we're really looking at three things. So first and foremost, because it is a new business, they want to know, can they trust you? That is your credit score. That is what, have you paid back everybody who's lent you money in the past? That is your skin in the game. That's your job experience and your resume. Then they want to know, can they trust the business? Are their projections well thought out? Are they conservative? Does the business plan explain the assumptions? Is there a need in the market that is easily understood and conveyed? And is it financially viable? And the last thing they want to know is, what happens if? What happens if a competitor opens up next door? What happens if you get sick, right? And the what happens if question is really about collateral. It's that I trust you, I trust the business, but if something goes wrong, is there something that I can take and sell and make some of my money back and reduce my risk, right? So the can they trust you piece, we talked about the credit score. They'll also ask for a personal financial statement, which lays out your assets and your liabilities and your obligations. That down payment and personal guarantee becomes very, important, because that's not only your skin in the game and you saying, yes, I have as much or more to risk as I'm asking you to risk, but it also reduces their exposure, right? So what's a good example? If I'm buying real estate, right, and the bank says I will lend you 90% of the purchase price for that real estate, they want me to pay 10%, not just for my skin in the game, but because the bank is saying, hey, if we have to take this piece of real estate back and sell it ourselves, we're not going to get 100 cents on the dollar. We're not going to get 100% of the value. We have to pay a broker. We have to pay an attorney to file the appropriate documents to take possession. We have to cover the utilities for that property. We have to cover the real estate taxes and the insurance for that property while we own it. And hopefully we're able to sell it for, in a quick turnaround in a quick period. But they want you to cover some of that exposure so that they can say, well, if we get 90 cents on the dollar, 90% of what that real estate is worth, we come out whole. We don't really care about your 10%. We care about our 90%, right? So that collateral piece is important to realize that, that they're not just asking for your equity because they want to see you suffer. They're trying to kind of shore up their own risk, right? And then your resume is equally important. Have you done this work before? Do you understand the effort it takes to do what you were setting out to do? The business plan is really two pieces that tell the same story, right? There's the business plan, which is a written narrative of what you plan on doing and how you plan to do it. And then there's this financial projections piece. And financial projections say month by month, here's the money that comes in and my expenses that go out. And here's what's left over, the little bit that's left over to pay the debt, what I'm asking for with the sources and uses, right? And that'll tell them the working capital need, how much do I go down before I come back out? And it'll tell them that you're able to pay that debt over a period of time as laid out. Now, A business plan is an interesting piece because you think about the financial statement, and a lot of those things are not actually addressed in the business plan because a lot of the projections are pretty self-explanatory. Rent, we know. Insurance, you have a quote for. Utilities, we have historic, we can ask the landlord or the previous property owner for historic utility costs. So we can plug those in, and that's pretty self-explanatory. The big part of a business plan is talking about revenue, right? Because that is always the biggest question mark. If money comes into a business, everything works, right? We can cover our costs, we have our profit margin built in, we sleep at night. If money doesn't come in, then nothing works, right? So the business plan is about reaching the customers, your competition analysis, your price point and operations, your value proposition. It's all trying to say who wants what I'm offering, what are they willing to pay for it, and how am I communicating with them, right? It's probably 70 or 80% of that written narrative is just that one line item on the financial projection. But if that works together and says, yep, my projections work, I have decent credit score, I have some equity involved, then we get to this third piece, which is what is the collateral available? If it's real estate, banks love that. That's not going anywhere. Good manufacturing equipment, they like that too. Inventory, we talked about that, a little more squishy, right? If it's a restaurant and you have a couple $1,000s in food inventory, by the time the bank needs to step in and take that, it's not going to be worth much, right? So like, how is that inventory valued or managed? Is it tangible or is it really kind of an intangible sunk cost? And the bank will likely ask for what's called a personal guarantee, which means you stand behind a loan whether or not the business is able to succeed, right? On occasion, you can ask for that personal guarantee to be released after a period of time in which the business is able to prove its own strength, usually kind of 3 to 5 years. But for a startup, that is almost always going to be part of this conversation with the bank because they want to know that that payment is going to be made, win, lose, or draw. Just to kind of wrap the conversation around banking up, if you do go to a bank, they're usually going to ask for a credit check, a personal financial statement, resume, business plan, projections, and a sources and uses, right? That sources and uses says, here's exactly what I need to make this work. And here's essentially a list of collateral available to you. So if we go through this and we say, okay, I have some money to put down and I'm asking for this from the bank, but they run their collateral package and they come back and they say, well, we love that you're asking for 77,000. You're willing to put in 20,000. We'll give you 40,000. And you say, oh, well, that leaves me short, right? I'm still short, whatever the math is, 17,000. So then we can start matching our uses of cash with who would be most interested in supporting, right? So these are some things that I've seen be successful and not successful, right? So personal debt or equity or investors, like you can go out and find friends, family, fools, the 3 Fs, that we look for. Vendors sometimes offer terms. So if you're looking at inventory and you're like, I can't finance $10,000 worth of inventory, but maybe I can, buy it with 90-day terms or 60-day terms and essentially turn it as I go and pay the vendor, and they act as a short-term lender. Essentially, that's a conversation you can have with your suppliers, with your vendors. Landlords are always an interesting one, right? If a good portion of your purchase price or your investment or your uses of cash is fit out, is construction, if the landlord plans on retaining that, essentially you're asking a bank to lend you money to improve a different bank's collateral, right? That's the landlord's ownership that you're improving their building. And some banks aren't willing to do that. You can't put in a whole new sink and fire suppression system. And if the business goes south, go back in and tear that out, right? Like there's no money once you paid for it, that money is in the building. And so what you could do is you could offer the landlord an increased rent and allow the landlord to cover that startup cost and build it into your model that way, right? So there are ways to say, I can't cover this cost. I can't borrow to cover this cost. I'm still interested in the space. Can we build it into the lease in a way that the business is able to cover that cost over the period of the lease? There are gap lenders like Community Concepts, Fame, and CEI are all considered gap lenders in the state of Maine, and they are there to kind of fill that gap, sometimes in a secondary position behind a primary lender. Invoice factoring can work on occasion if you have big orders come in from large vendors, US military, large grocery store orders. There are vendors or there are banks that will factor that invoice, essentially lend you what you need to provide for the cost of goods and the labor, and then they will collect that invoice on the back end. Retailers will sometimes, do $0 down equipment financing in-house. And so rather than borrowing money from a bank to go buy a piece of equipment, you can work directly with the retailer. Always take a hard look at the terms that they offer, but in some situations, that's a way to move forward. Credit cards, I would say, please come talk to an advisor before you use credit cards to get your business off the ground. That is almost always a bad idea, and there's almost always better ways to go about it. Just because it is easy money does not make it a good source of cash. Crowdsourcing is what I threw in here. We've seen that be successful in some cases and unsuccessful in others. The crowdsourcing websites do charge a decent amount, and the benefit is that they sometimes offer advertising. So if you have a product that can be sold or pre-sold or take on pre-orders, and it's an easy conversion rate to see that math play out, and you can take deposits and you reach a wider audience through that crowdfunding source, then it's a good idea. If all of your audience is local and direct and it's a service provision or it's retail that is local only, it might be better to just go directly to your customer base as part of that pre-launch advertising outreach and take pre-orders. I've also seen some people finance a portion of their uses of cash through pre-orders and taking deposits. It's risky, there's legal implications there, so make sure you understand what you are selling and what your obligations are associated with that, but it's an opportunity. So that gets you to, 901, you flip that sign to open and you're open, you have your sources of cash and your uses of cash. And then you need this working capital piece. So in this example, right, we have my 77,000, I have my 30,000, from the bank. I went to the landlord and worked in a $15,000 leasehold improvement cost. So that piece of the uses and the sources match. And I built that into my lease. I went to my mom, she lent me $10,000 and I had 22,000 of my own. So I am ready to go, right? So this is a big picture, but this is everything we've been talking about, right? So my sources and uses will tell me how I'm financing it, my debt or investors, where it's coming from. If it's debt investors, that's going to require a business plan, which is a written justification of my assumptions, for my income statement, which is that projections. And if I take in my projections and my support of my balance sheet, which we'll get to in a moment, that's my cash flow. And my cash flow shortfall becomes my sources and uses, or the working capital portion of that, right? So one thing that I see often that banks don't like is working capital broken out, right? So if you say, oh, I need rent for 6 months, and you include that in your uses of cash statement, well, that's fine, but if your rent gets paid, but your advertising budget doesn't, are you still in business? Or you don't manage to cover your payroll, are you still in business, right? So instead of calling out specific expenses, once you hit that 9:01 a.m., it's all grouped together in working capital. In that cash flow projection, saying here's where cash comes in, here are all of my expenses, And here is my shortfall, kind of one period to the next. That's a good way to capture all of that information in one single number rather than saying, well, rent's more important than utilities or payroll or something else, right? So don't differentiate your expenses once you start. It is simply, do I have enough or not? And the projections model will help you do that effectively. And that kind of leads us to our last piece. So we have our sources and uses. We understand how they flow together. Uses of cash being a confident, expectation of how we can get this business off the ground and every dollar we need to do so. And our sources of cash matching that. We have everything we need as long as that bank agrees to lend us $30,000 and we're confident to move forward. So the sources always match the uses. And this becomes our balance sheet on day one, which is one of the 3 financial statements that you'll learn, as you start your business and explore this further. But this took me longer to put together than I'd like to admit. Your sources and uses match, right? We have to have a dollar for every dollar that we need. Otherwise, we're still looking and we're not confident to move forward. And our uses of cash will all become assets. It's either tangible assets or intangible assets or just cash as an asset. But those are all assets, right? We've invested in our assets. And our assets have to be covered by one of 2 things. It's either equity or it's debt, right? Going back to that house analogy, if my house is worth $400,000 and I have a loan of $350,000 on it, my equity is $50,000. My assets are always going to be equal to debt and equity. And as I pay that mortgage down, my equity increases, right? So those 2 things will always equal one another. And so my uses of cash become my assets, and my sources are going to become either debt or equity. And so my balance sheet is now established. And I can test that because I know my assets are always equal to debt and equity combined. So as long as that equation balances out, I have a balance sheet that is effective, and some banks will ask for that as part of your application. And I have a sources and uses of cash that says, here's what I need this money for, and here's where it's coming from. So that's your sources and uses. That's why a bank asks for it, the confidence of knowing what it takes to get your business off the ground. And that's how the balance sheet and the rest of your cash flow statements and your business plan all support that documentation together. Thanks for listening, and keep in touch if there's anything else we can do to help.